August 1st, 2008. Syrian General Mohammed Soleiman was hosting a dinner party at his mansion in the picturesque coastal city of Tartus. As the sun set over the Mediterranean Sea, Soleiman invited his guests to join him on the balcony for a drink. In the water below, 100 meters away, 2 snipers were floating, waiting. Unknown to Soleiman, his every move was being watched. He peered over the balcony, taking one last look at the crimson sky before rejoining his guests. 2 bullets hit the general in the neck and the head. He collapsed in front of his guests. Below, the assassins dove below the surface of the water and disappeared. Who were these mysterious killers, and what led to their planned killing of one of the most powerful men in Syria? Welcome to Covert, a show about the shadowy world of international espionage and top-secret military operations.
North Korea was building a nuclear reactor in Syria.
I'm Jamie Rennell, and I'm going to take you inside history's greatest special forces missions to learn about the brave soldiers who risked their lives to terminate the world's most wanted men, eliminate terrorist threats, and protect countless innocent lives.
If there was a mistake made and they were compromised, that could have been war.
Even if you've been in 100 special missions, you're always afraid.
This is the untold story of how Israel's ruthless Special Forces unit foiled Syria's secret plan to develop a nuclear bomb. This is the Syrian nuclear strike. For 7 years, the identity of the general's killers remained unknown. But in 2015, the website WikiLeaks, founded by controversial whistleblower Julian Assange, released several top-secret U.S. government documents. Among these documents were papers that revealed that the assassination was likely the work of one of the most legendary fighting forces in the world, Israel's assassination specialists, the Kidon.
The Mossad certainly had a specialty team that often crossed borders into hostile countries. It was known as the Kidon team.
That's Dan Raviv. He's written extensively on Israel's secretive spy networks.
Kidon means bayonet. They were known within the Mossad for assassinations.
Nate Thayer, an investigative journalist who's spent 25 years reporting on the Middle East.
Among even their enemies, they are respected as extremely talented and well-trained in the operations theater.
But to understand the story, we need to start in a very different part of the world. North Korea in 2004.
In April of 2004, there was a massive train explosion in northern North Korea. It killed several hundred people, destroyed a town of 10,000 people, left 2,000 people wounded.
The explosion was so powerful that earthquake monitoring stations in the United States and Russia registered the blast as a 3.6 on the Richter scale, the equivalent of a small earthquake. The North Korean government said that the train was carrying liquefied petroleum. But before anyone could discover anything more, the regime banned further reporting on the incident. Now, there's nothing new about North Korea being suddenly secretive, but it was strange enough to draw the attention of someone 5,000 miles away. Israel's top spy, Meir Dagan, followed the incident with great interest. Dagan was the chief of the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad and known for being ruthless in his defense of the Jewish state. Here's Guardian reporter Ian Black on Dagan's reputation.
He was head of the Mossad, I think, for longer than anybody else did that job, and he had a reputation for being very decisive and very brutal in what he was prepared to do in pursuit of Israel's national security interests.
Dagan's curiosity about the explosion turned to concern as intelligence reports started coming in. Nate Thayer again.
There was a Syrian military plane that arrived about 4 days afterwards, and Syrian and North Koreans dressed in chemical weapons suits actually carried the bodies, which were in lead-encased transport, back to Syria on a Syrian military plane.
Contact between North Korea and Syria. That was unusual. North Korea is a rogue state, hell-bent on developing nuclear weapons, and the Syrian government rejected the existence of Israel. To Dagan, the two countries working together was deeply concerning. Syria and Israel have had a fraught and often violent relationship since the State of Israel was established in 1948. The British government, who controlled Palestine, gave the Jews a section of the country to call their own. The State of Israel was born, and the Jewish people had a place they could be safe from persecution. But the British neglected to consider the people currently inhabiting the area, and within a day of Israel's independence, they were attacked by neighboring countries, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, and Jordan. Israel had been given more territory than any of them had expected, and resulted in thousands of Palestinians being forcefully evicted from their homes. After 10 months of fighting, Israel, though greatly outnumbered, won the first Arab-Israeli war. Both countries have fought over territory in subsequent Arab-Israeli wars, and the tensions with Syria continue to this day. And so, the gigantic explosion and the strange meetings between Syrian and North Korean officials raised a terrifying possibility for Dagan. He had to find out more. It became a top priority for Mossad and would eventually lead to one of the most extraordinary black ops missions of all time. It's amazing what these special ops teams can do with the help of science and technology. And you know what else science and technology can help with? Hair loss. That's right, I'm talking about Hims. Maybe you're like me, when you notice something wrong, I don't know, some strange rash, or you have to squint to read anything clearly, and you know you should do something about it, but you don't. I tell myself maybe it'll get better on its own, right? Well, when it comes to hair loss, that's a terrible idea. Because thanks to science, hair loss is optional. But guys, you have to act when you first notice it. That's why there's 4hims.com, the one-stop shop for hair loss, skincare, and sexual wellness for men. They have well-known generic equivalents of name-brand prescriptions to help you keep your hair. No doctor visits, no waiting rooms. You just answer a few questions and the products are shipped right to your door. Here's the really cool part. Listeners of Covert can get a trial month of Hims for just $5 today, right now, while supplies last. See their website for full details, but this would cost like hundreds of dollars if you went to the doctor or pharmacy. Go to 4hims.com/OPS. That's FORHIMS.com/OPS to order. 4hims.com/OPS. Let's get back to it. England, 2006. 2 years later, a high-ranking Syrian nuclear official travels to London, alone. Here's Ronan Bergman, an Israeli military analyst and investigative journalist.
He comes to London, residing in a poshy hotel. He has a meeting tomorrow morning in London, but he has the night or the evening to spend. He leaves his room, leaves the laptop in the room, goes to the bar of the hotel, and extremely happy that in the bar he meets a woman. He is impressed by her good character, and he's also happy to understand that she's also impressed by him, and she speaks French. He comes from a Syrian elite family. He speaks fluent French. They started to speak.
But what he didn't know was that he was being watched by Kidon operatives, who were tipped off when he used a fake name on his flight.
The Israelis dispatched 3 teams of people to monitor him. One team was at Heathrow to monitor his arrival and track his movements. Another was a team specialized in breaking into hotel rooms and taking information from computers. And another was from the assassination unit of Israeli intelligence.
The Syrian continued to flirt with the woman. She was attentive, beautiful, and they seemed to have similar interests.
Orders another drink and another drink, and he's confident that he has a wonderful way of spending the night.
But his confidence was misplaced.
He just doesn't know that this woman is a part of a Mossad crew, and she was there to keep him busy while her team is breaking into his hotel room.
3 Israeli Black Ops agents walked unnoticed through the hotel lobby, dressed as tourists, and entered the hallway outside the man's room upstairs. Within seconds, they hacked the electronic lock on his hotel room. And they were in luck. The man had left his laptop beside his bed, unprotected. In a few seconds, the Black Ops team had transferred the entire contents of the laptop to Mossad HQ in Tel Aviv. Nate Thayer.
They took all the information from the computer, and then they put devices on the computer to monitor any future activity from that computer. That information was sent back to be analyzed in Israel.
15 minutes later, Dagan and his analysts studied the files in Tel Aviv. They'd hit the jackpot. Hundreds of photos documenting the construction of a strange-looking industrial facility. The building's walls and roof were covered with corrugated iron to make it look like an innocent barn by satellites. Dagan was initially unsure of what the images were showing him, but then it dawned on him. It's an exact replica of something he had seen before in intelligence images from North Korea.
What they found on his computer was really rather extraordinary. But what it included were blueprints of nuclear power plants, pictures of nuclear power plants, pictures of the head of the Syrian nuclear weapons program standing in the desert with the head of the North Korean nuclear weapons program. So the Israelis realized that this was very, very important information, to the point where the Prime Minister of Israel flew to Washington to have a secret meeting with George Bush.
Elliot Abrams, George W. Bush's national security advisor, remembers the meeting well.
Well, the day that General Dagan came in with all of this material, we didn't know anything. We had zero information about a Syrian nuclear reactor. And what we could see was that this was a fairly advanced construction of a nuclear reactor that was 2/3 finished. I mean, the whole superstructure was there. The second thing we could see was that if you compared it to the Yongbyon North Korean nuclear reactor, it was exactly the same reactor. That is, it was obviously a North Korean construction. The two were perfectly matched. The Israelis said one thing right at the start, and that was, however this reactor got started and whenever it got started, the end is clear. The reactor is intolerable. We're not going to allow it, and it's going to go away.
They knew what it was, but where exactly was it? Syria is a large country that stretches across 114,000 square miles of mountains, deserts, farmland, and forest. Dan Raviv.
So the head of the Mossad, Dagan, he ordered his research department to get every possible reconnaissance photo from overflights and even more from Israel's spy satellites. And they were repositioned, in fact, to fly over Syria more often. And the Mossad had its experts, as well as military experts on reconnaissance, who looked, well, really at every square mile of Syria, looking for anything that might have to do with nuclear work.
But finding one building among the vast wilderness of Syria was painstaking work, and the reactor was potentially only weeks from completion. Dagan needed to move faster. Then, something clicked. Nuclear reactors require a constant source of fresh water for cooling. So Israeli satellites focused on scanning the banks of the Euphrates, Syria's most powerful river. But it still proved a problem. The river is 1,700 miles long. The building could still take weeks to find. What they needed was luck, or successful wiretapping. The next morning, an intelligence report arrived from the U.S. Nate Thayer.
The National Security Agency of the U.S. intercepted a very unusual spike of telephone communications from this location at Al-Kabar, which is in the middle of nowhere in the desert, to Pyongyang, North Korea. And they couldn't figure out what was going on in the desert that we'd be calling Pyongyang. They passed that information over to the intelligence signals unit of Israeli intelligence, who put it on a priority list and started following the area closely.
Dagan's team found the remote town of Al-Kibar on the map, and it was directly on the Euphrates River. Israeli satellites immediately began scanning every foot of land on the banks near the town. Within an hour, they had spotted something.
The first breakthrough from all this extra espionage was when a building was spotted 130 feet by 130 feet by 70 feet. That's what Israeli reconnaissance analysts said. And it was very far from the capital, Damascus. It was in a remote part of northeastern Syria, but not far from the Euphrates River and the border with Iraq.
They had found the reactor, but it was the first step of many. Destroying it, that was a whole other scenario. Ronan Bergman.
If the reactor is already active, then a full destruction of the reactor might cause an enormous environmental pollution and poisoning that will affect Syrian population, maybe Lebanese population, Turkish, maybe Israeli.
But Dagan didn't know how close to completion the reactor was.
The dates on the JPEGs were 15 months old, so this facility must be more advanced.
They couldn't proceed without better intel, and that meant only one solution: sending armed scouts into a hostile country to spy on its military program. If they were caught, it could spark a major international crisis. Israel had only one group capable of pulling off a mission like this: former Navy SEAL Team 6 Commando Don Mann.
The Sayeret Matkal, commonly known as the unit, they're considered, if not the best counter-terrorist unit in the world, at least one of the very, very best. When people ask about their work, they shut right down. They don't talk about it. They're very, very secretive. Most of the work that the unit does, we don't hear about it. They look more like a regular soldier or civilian, and that's to their advantage because they can sneak in and sneak out of an area without drawing any attention to themselves at all.
On an overcast night in midsummer, the Sayeret Matkal commandos set out on their mission. 2 Sikorsky helicopters traveled at low altitude to bring them across the border into Syria. Dan Raviv.
Israelis were able to get on the ground within about a mile of this mystery building in northeastern Syria.
The operatives quickly got out of the helicopter and began walking. After just 10 minutes, the lights of Al-Kibar appeared on the horizon, and they reached a small perimeter fence. But instead of entering the compound, the commandos began taking samples of the sand beneath their feet. They also filled 2 small containers with water embedded in vehicle tracks heading from the main gate.
Of course, they took photographs, but also took soil samples, hoping that something in the soil, in the air, in the water nearby might contain some evidence, perhaps of nuclear work.
The unit flew into Syria and did their intel collection on the ground, right at the site, near the site. That was extremely dangerous. And really, if there was a mistake made and they were compromised, that could have been war. That could have been the result. Syria and Israel weren't in good terms.
Collecting these samples was the most important part of the mission. It would tell them just how close the project was to completion and how much time they had to act.
It was assumed that if the reactor is active, then a very small portion, not lethal, but very, very small portion of radioactive substance would be found in the water.
Suddenly, on the horizon, the unit saw a caravan of vehicles heading out from the nuclear reactor. With samples in hand, the Sayeret Matkal operatives made chase into the night. Just as they took off, there was shouting, and men below them were scanning the area with flashlights.
They were almost caught. They left the scene in the very last minute. The expertise of Sayeret Matkal, Unit 269, is to infiltrate enemy countries, far away behind enemy lines, do whatever they need to do, and come back safely.
Former Special Forces Colonel Sharon Gott has been on similar Israeli Black Ops missions and recalls what it's like to go behind enemy lines.
You always fear, okay? Even if you've been in 100 special missions, you're always afraid because you feel death all the time. Over here, if we don't do very daring missions, we can lose Israel. The Israeli Special Forces are not the strongest people in the world, they're not the fastest people in the world, they're not the best runners in the world, they're not the best shooters in the world, but they have some kind of a mindset that makes them very determined, very flexible in their thinking, and that's where I think the reputation comes from.
Back in Tel Aviv, in a government lab, the sand and water samples were exhaustively tested. No nuclear contamination was found. What this indicated was that the nuclear reactor was not yet fully operational. It could be destroyed before it was activated. Now, what was the best course of action?
The two broad choices were to attack on the ground, hoping that in secret you could get enough Israeli commandos and explosives to the scene to blow up the building. But frankly, the Israeli military had doubts about that. It wouldn't just be sending in men, but also equipment. It would not be easy.
You have a very large reactor built of reinforced concrete and other steel, other such components. You can't send 5 guys in there, with backpacks full of explosives. There's not enough explosives.
September 5th, 2007. 20 elite Israeli pilots were performing routine training maneuvers over the Negev desert when they were told to change over to dangerous, steep-angle dive-bombing runs, focusing on a small practice target. Watching from the ground was General Eliezer Shkedi, head of the Israeli Air Force. As he observed the practice dives, he picked out the best 8 pilots in the exercise. Later that night, the 8 pilots were contacted and ordered to their planes. The pilots arrived at their jets to find them fully armed with giant Maverick missiles, 500-pound bombs, and external fuel tanks. It was clear they were heading into sudden combat.
8 Israeli planes, 4 F-16s and 4 F-15s, took off from a base in northern Israel. They headed west over the Mediterranean, then to the north, then turned east over Turkey's airspace.
The pilots were still unclear on their objective. Then, a radio alert came in from General Shkedi himself. He announced that they had been personally selected to take part in Operation Orchard, a top-secret mission to destroy Syria's nuclear weapons program in heavily defended Syrian airspace. General Amos Yadlin is a seasoned Israeli fighter pilot who speculates the pilot's state of mind.
I was a fighter pilot who prepared himself to destroy the nuclear reactor.
General Yadlin had his hand in a similar mission. In June 1981, he was ordered to fly into Iraq to bomb a 70-megawatt nuclear reactor that was being built by Saddam Hussein.
The whole operation from takeoff to the attack was 1 hour, 43 minutes and 30 seconds.
Yadlin's unit blew up the Iraqi nuclear weapons program without losing a pilot. But in other operations, they weren't so lucky.
I was in a squadron that out of 30 airplanes, we lose 17. 8 pilots were killed. 5 pilots become prisoners of war. It's a risky profession.
Because the Operation Orchard pilots faced an even greater threat. Syria had spent decades developing a formidable anti-aircraft defense system. So, as the squadron flew on towards Syrian airspace, Israeli hackers set themselves to work.
The Israelis had better technology. They had electronic countermeasures that fooled the Syrian air defenses.
Across Syria, the air traffic control radar screens suddenly turned off, making the operators blind to the skies above them. Then, just as suddenly, they switched back on, revealing that they were under attack from hundreds of enemy planes coming from all directions. As panic set in, the screens flashed a third time, and the monitors showed no planes at all.
In this case, the attacking aircraft were able to use a system that not only blinded Syria's air defenses, but actually made the Syrian system think that everything was normal, as though the radar screens were absolutely fine, but the Israeli planes were invisible.
Now, in enemy airspace, the pilots moved on to the next stage of the operation. The onboard computers were set to the precise coordinates of the Al-Kibar complex. The planes turned south to begin their bombing run.
So this is the risky time. Flying very low, very fast in the enemy area that is well defended. This is where your breathing become much more high pulse. And then you have 1 minute that you are exposed to everybody. And you are not defending yourself because you are concentrating on aiming on the target. This is the 1 minute that the most difficult of the flight.
As the clock struck midnight, the fighters began their descent and their assault. Multiple bombs made direct contact, sending a giant fireball into the sky. The pilots pulled up after dropping 17 tons of explosives. 3 minutes later, they doubled back past the reactor, which was now just smoking ruins and rubble. For good measure, they dropped a second batch of bombs. This would ensure that every inch of the reactor had been obliterated. The mission was complete, and not a single Israeli plane had been lost. In Tel Aviv, the IDF called the White House to tell them that something that never existed no longer exists.
The Syrians were taken totally by surprise. They destroyed their target, they exited, they lost nothing. The Syrian response was silence.
This bombing of the nuclear reactor was now referred to as one of the most important moments in Israel's history, and a mission that the country only admitted to on March 21, 2018. It was destroyed fast and smoothly, but there was still the haunting question: how did Syria get so close to developing a nuclear weapons program without anyone else noticing? Mossad intelligence started investigating, and what they found was that the Syrians' strategy had been as simple and clever as the Israelis' air raid was. Ronan Bergman.
They took a flight back in time. In the most sensitive issues, let's not use any sort of electronic transmission. Every time we want to send a message from, or a plan, or an executive order from a place to place in Syria, we will print a hard copy, put it in an envelope, seal it with wax, write بشكل سري, top secret, and build a network of couriers on motorcycles that would take these envelopes from place to place.
What was most concerning to Israel was that the mastermind behind Syria's top-secret nuclear program was one General Mohammed Soleiman, a man who openly despised Israel. So long as he was in power, Israel would be his main target.
Now, with the reactor being destroyed, one of his main, the crown jewel of his operations was in rubbles. But still, he and his talented bureaucratic and organizational capabilities are still around. So, what do you do?
Mohammed Suleiman was the most powerful, closest advisor to the current leader of Syria, Assad. He came to prominence when Assad's father died in 2001. He was in charge of all of their chemical weapons, research, development, and acquisition, as well as their nuclear power program and nuclear weapons and technology program, and their ballistic missile program. He was the man responsible for all of the North Korean and Hezbollah security while they were living or working in Syria. He was a very, very powerful man.
The general was also a notoriously cautious man. His movements were known only to a few. His home in Damascus was heavily guarded. But in the summer of 2008, Mossad discovered Soleiman was planning to spend a weekend at his villa in Tartus, on the coast. Security there was far more relaxed. While the house was well guarded at the main entrance, it was totally exposed from the sea. Fast forward to August 1st, 2008, in Syrian territorial waters. A yacht sailed the Mediterranean coast. It was registered to a wealthy businessman, but today the crew were of a different profession. Nate Thayer.
They sent in one of their intelligence assassination teams in a ship off the coast of Tartus.
Around a kilometer off the coast, the yacht dropped anchor, and the assassins, in scuba diving equipment, lowered themselves into the sea. As the sun set, the snipers dove underwater, stopping around 100 meters from General Soleiman's home. From the sea, they can hear the sound of the dinner party in the distance. Suddenly, Soleiman appeared on the balcony. In their earpieces, the snipers heard an electronic countdown. They meant to fire simultaneously. Soleiman leaned over the balcony to admire the sunset. Both bullets found their target, one in the head, one in the neck. The operatives sunk back into the water, then back to the boat.
There is no doubt in independent analysts' minds that Israel carried out that assassination. In fact, the U.S. Embassy, in secret cables that have come out through WikiLeaks, in its report said that Israel carried out the assassination of Suleiman. The Syrians believe it. The evidence points to it. The Israelis do not talk publicly about killing people overseas because it's actually against the rules. But they do say things, including in this incident, they referred to it as a very happy accident.
It was never admitted or proved absolutely, but it's considered common consensus that Israel used their Kidon Black Ops unit to assassinate General Soleiman. But what is known is that Syria has not built another reactor.
Because we live in a neighborhood that the neighbors don't like us. We're surrounded with enemies. On 3 sides of Israel we have enemies. On the other side, on the 4th side, we have the sea. If we don't fight for ourselves, if we don't make sure that Israel is strong, we'll go to the sea. That's what happens here in Israel.
In the next episode, a cafe held hostage, gunfire in a public marketplace. Mumbai, the richest and most populated city in India, is under constant attack.
So on the night of the incident, I left the restaurant. Everything was moving in slow motion. It's a little bit like when you fall off your bike and you fly through the air and imagine what pain lies ahead of you. I didn't see what was happening. I could just see people running in a very strange way and things blurred and a tunnel vision view of what was happening. It was a couple of, maybe a second, well, what seemed like a number of seconds later, but possibly a split second later, that I heard some gunshots and saw people running up the staircase, the sort of broad sweeping staircase up to the mezzanine level. Obviously very panicked, and then a number of them started to fall as the gunshots started sounding. And that was when I realized that something fairly bad was happening.
Until the Indian Special Forces, the Black Cats, take back control of the streets. That's next time on Covert. Covert is an Audio Boom and World Media Rights co-production, hosted by me, Jamie Rennell. It is produced by Audio Boom's Ben Hosley and Rachel Jacobs, and Pascal Hughes for World Media Rights. We had editing help by David Markowitz, with additional production from World Media Rights by Gerald Zabengwa and Damian Thorpe. David McNabb is the series creative director, and the executive producers for Audio Boom are Brendan Regan and Stuart Last. If you haven't already, don't forget to follow us on Spotify or subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you find your favorite shows. And if you've got some time, give us a review.